Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our fourth and final session of today's conference and symposium. Our session today is called In Polish Concert Music, and I have the great privilege of briefly introducing our two speakers. Our first speaker this afternoon will be Dr. Mackenzie Pierce, who is an assistant professor of musicology at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. His paper is called Dialectics of Acculturation and Antisemitism in Interwar Polish Concert Music. So please join me now in warmly welcoming Dr. Mackenzie Pierce.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for so many rich papers earlier today, and thank you for still being here in the final session of today's very rich talk, or symposium, I should say. So this paper was prompted by the final two sentences of the call for papers that were issued, it feels like another era, almost a year ago, I think. I think these express with great nuance an issue that's certainly been on my mind, and judging from the other papers that I've heard today, also on the minds of many of us here today. And that issue is, how do we not reinscribe the damaging discourses that we're talking about, often by highlighting the voices of the victims that we study through their own words, even if those are done under circumstances of immense duress or challenge. But I have to admit, I've also begun to feel a bit of ambivalence about this impulse for a few reasons. What of the many cases when those most affected did not respond, or did not respond in ways that seem, in retrospect, commiserate to the violence that they encountered? More trenchantly, how can we be sure that when we try to give voice to something, we're not selectively reading the archive in ways that highlight our own priorities of memory in the present? In other words, how can we not only historicize the concept of anti-Semitism as a flourishing body of critical, provocative, perhaps groundbreaking scholarship and history has attempted to do, but also how can we listen more attentively to the various responses to it within musical culture? So those are big questions that I'll be trying to talk with you a little bit about today. These concerns arose as I was writing a book about Polish and Polish-Jewish relations within classical music across the middle of the 20th century. And since this book has been published about 2 weeks ago, you'll have to forgive me, thank you. Have to forgive me if I promote it for a few more seconds, perhaps a little bit more than is good taste. So it's a multivocal narrative of an integrated Polish and Polish-Jewish musical community. It spans from the 30s into the 50s, so it covers the period of the Holocaust, the German occupation, the Soviet occupation. And it's in particular focused on acculturated Polish-speaking Jewish musicians. While this group was numerically small, acculturated Polish Jews played a huge role in the country's classical music scene as performers, composers, critics, organizers, audience members, and patrons. So the book not only documents the centrality of Polish Jews to the creation of concert music in Poland, but also shows how their importance has been downplayed after the war. My goal was not only to reveal some of the ethno-nationalist underpinnings of narratives of 20th century composition in Poland, it was also to try to supplant those narratives with new ones that centered on the promises and failures of music to aid integration across difference. So today, I'm not going to be grappling so much with the nature of anti-Semitism in Polish musical culture or the discourses, the various forms it took. See the book for that. But rather I want to reflect on the archive of responses to anti-Semitism within this world. I'm using the term archive here not only to refer to piles of papers that are acquired by libraries and made available to researchers, but in a somewhat more metaphorical, post-structuralist sense to describe what is enunciated in the first place and what becomes the objects of the histories that we study. Scholars who set out to assess how acculturated Polish Jewish musicians responded to anti-Semitism might well find a curious archive in which the presence of anti-Semitism in Polish musical culture and responses to it can often seem kind of faint. The nature of the archive is certainly not the only reason why scholars have struggled to acknowledge anti-Semitism as a core ideology that shaped the institutions and discourses of classical music in modern Poland, but I would suggest it's one of the key factors, or at least one of the important factors. So in today's talk, I'm going to focus on one individual, his encounters with anti-Semitism and his responses to it. That person is Mateusz Gliński, who is a publisher, a conductor, and a musical organizer of quite wide ambitions. I'm going to discuss some of the anti-Semitic undertones of the so-called intrigues that he endured in the 20s and 30s, and his responses to these often much later. I'll say up front that I have chosen him for a few reasons. One is that he left behind a relatively large body of writing, so there's much to talk about with regard to him. But I'd also say that the similar argument could have been made about many other musicians from this time and place who are similar to him in cultural background, educational status, and general commitments. With that in mind, there are two big caveats before I begin. The first is that Polish Jewry of the 20s and 30s was incredibly diverse in terms of culture, language, politics, and so forth. So I want to be very careful to limit my claims here to talking about acculturated Polish-speaking Jewish musicians. I'm not necessarily making claims that extend beyond that. And second, I want to acknowledge that the question of labeling is an incredibly fraught one. It always is, but in this time and place where you have both a high level of integration and acculturation and also a high level of racialized discrimination, labels can very quickly get us into a hall of mirrors. So keep those 2 points in mind as we continue. So first, Gliński's intrigues. Born in 1892, Maciusz Gliński trained in Warsaw in music and law before continuing his musical education in Leipzig with Max Reger and in Russia with Alexander Glazunov. He returned to Warsaw in 1918 as revolution consumed the Russian Empire, and he soon opened a law practice which he ran until the Second World War. He was one of a number of musical figures in interwar Poland whose main significance lay not with performance or composition, but rather in organizing the musical life of the country. That is to say, he wished to create an infrastructure in which classical music could flourish. He was a founding member of the Polish section of the International Society for Contemporary Music, an organization that aimed to support modernist composition across Europe and hosted an annual festival in various cities. And most germane for today's discussion, he founded the periodical Muzyka, or Music, which was in operation from 24 until 1938. This would be one of the most significant Polish-language music periodicals of the interwar years, which aimed to engage a broad audience of readers interested in classical music. Reflecting a widespread anxiety about Poland's place in a post-World War I political landscape, Muzyka aimed to, quote, bring Poland's musical life into close proximity to the artistic currents of Europe, unquote. In practice, this meant that the periodical served as a conduit for ideas from France, Germany, and the UK into Poland. His contacts across Europe and his knowledge of many languages helped ensure that Muzyka reprinted the latest debates, artistic statements, and aesthetic credos from the western part of the continent. Journals like Signal and Kroje Musical were models for format and content. So indicative of the international scope and of his artistic ambitions, the inaugural issue invites readers to flip between Karol Szymanowski's Fryderyk Chopin and the Myths of the Polish Soul, an excerpt from Busoni's On the Essence of Music, an interview with Stravinsky on his neoclassical works, which was published both in the original French and in Polish translation, and a meditation on the role of music criticism from the anti-modernist critic Stanisław Niewiadomowski. Despite his high-minded intentions, Muzyka's 14-year press run was clouded by opposition from enemies and one-time allies. These intrigues, as they're often described, included polemics against the journal, the creation of parallel organizations that undercut his mission, and repeated attempts to deny its state-backed funding, which were ultimately successful. The interwar music community in Poland was quarrelsome, and polemics against individuals and organizations were quite common. To some degree, Gliński's problems reflected broader antagonisms around aesthetics and around generational change in the community. And indeed, if one were to read the musical press of the interwar years alone, the attacks on him might seem little more than common fights over scarce resources or the newest chapter in the ongoing debates between conservative and modernist critics and composers. But if one digs deeper, the story becomes more complicated. The preserved correspondence among his opponents reveals the degree to which their opposition to him was rooted in anti-Semitism. Private correspondence that discussed him often thought to undermine him by playing on the distinction between his name, Gliński, and his birth name of Herzenstein. The musicologist Adolf Hybinski, for example, wrote this first line, which I'm not going to read out loud to you, but you can read it for yourselves. And this second line here, this second quote, was from another Polish commentator who attacked Gliński not so much on ethics, but rather the very idea of a musical culture built in part by Jewish contributions. So early on, Glinski responded to such attacks, especially those that appeared in the right-wing press, by ignoring them and just underscoring that Musica was above all of this. In a 1925 letter, he wrote, quote, "Is it really worth paying attention to these accusations of working for the Jews and the Masons? In any case, I attempt to be truly without party loyalties and to allow expression to all the serious currents of our musical life," unquote. He'd often try to position himself above whatever antagonism was unfolding. But the intrigues became more consequential when they helped deny Musica state subventions. From as early as 1930, the notoriously anti-Semitic director of the Fund for National Culture denied funding to the journal. Then in 1934, the new director of musical activities in the Ministry of Religion and Public Education decided to remove all its funding from Musica and give it exclusively to a Polish national identified competitor. And with the funding for both of these main organizations cut off, Glinski continued to irregularly publish the journal, but it eventually shut down. So I want to now talk about a couple of the responses that he made to these intrigues a bit later. In 1940, with Warsaw under Nazi occupation, Glinski drew on his extensive professional contacts to flee the country. He secured an entry visa to Italy on the basis of a trumped-up invitation to conduct a cycle of Wagner operas in Brazil. Instead, he went to Rome, where he remained until 1957. Then he immigrated to North America, spent a year in Detroit, and he died in Canada, in Ontario, in 1976. During the war, he maintained an extensive correspondence with the musicologist Zdzisław Jachimecki, who was in Krakow, in which he reflected on the interwar years. And these are, to my knowledge, one of the earliest and most intimate archives of his responses to the intrigues of the prior decade. These letters describe him feeling an enormous nostalgia for time in Poland, as well as a yearning to remain a part of the scene he had left behind. He asks for news from his former friends. He talks about how important contact with these people was, despite the attacks on his journal and himself. At the same time, however, Glinski was able to establish himself in Rome with considerable ease. He wrote criticism for the paper of Vatican City, he gave talks, he reinvigorated his conducting career, and he founded a small vocal group at the time. These activities bled into the post-war decade, where he also resurrected the kind of internationalist project that Musica had earlier championed. He founded a journal, also called Musica, but now in Italian, and he had a concert series in the previous slide that performed music that came from different countries, many modernists. Such experiences led Glinski to compare Rome to his native Poland, and in 1946 he wrote the following. Now, there's a lot going on in this quote. I do want to point your attention to a few different things. The first is that he does not acknowledge the anti-Semitic dimension of the pre-war intrigues, which he casts instead as interpersonal squabbles. Nor does he explain why Italy has been more hospitable to him than Poland, although we might speculate on possible reasons for that. I think most intriguingly for me, however, is this final sentence or final couple of sentences where he continues to frame his work and his desires in terms of service to Poland as nation. The second response that I want to consider is called The Testament of Mateusz Glinski. And this is a book that sits uncomfortably between genres. It includes recollections from his colleagues, excerpts from his memoirs and other writings, and even an epic poem that was written by his widow, Zofia, which recounts various travails that he had. It was assembled by her after his death and published by a major Polish immigrant press in London in 1982. Mateusz most clearly weighs in the anti-Semitism that he encountered in a short essay titled In Defense of Musica, which was originally published in Poland in December 1967 and reprinted here. The main aim of the article is to contest the exclusion of his journal from a major anthology of music criticism published in 1951, and more broadly to express his concerns that his periodical had been written out of the history of interwar musical culture. The anti-Semitism underlying the attacks appears in one key passage. Again, I'm not going to read this, but I'll give you a second to look over it. Again, there's a lot going on here. The first thing to note, I think, is that Glinski does acknowledge anti-Semitism, sort of. He calls it fascist, racist tendencies, but he also elides the issue in several important ways. He casts anti-Semitism or fascist, racist tendencies as essentially external to Poland, something that has filtered in from Nazi Germany. In addition, he places the weight of the blame on the state, which he accuses of both supporting these tendencies and whose actions are cast as instigating the campaign against Musica and its editors. So the state is influenced by Nazi Germany, its actions and influence the people around him to be discriminatory. He thus paints the anti-Semitic colleagues in the musical community as victims of the ideologies that they endorsed and places blame on the Second Republic, which is defunct by this point. Needless to say, this view of Poles as victims of Nazism and of a hapless Second Republic would have squared very well with the memory politics of the Polish People's Republic during the 1960s. Traces of interwar anti-Semitism appear at two other points in the Testament. The first section of the book reprints numerous recollections of Glinski, which had been published originally in Polish in 1977. One recollection by the writer Jarosław Iwaszkiewicz states that, quote, Mateusz Glinski, who in fact had a different last name, was in reality a lawyer, unquote. This sentiment that Glinski was not really Polish and not really a musician is a direct recapitulation of the types of attacks that he experienced in the 1930s. She also includes, that is to say Zofia Glinska, includes a bunch of responses to Iwaszkiewicz, including her own letters expressing frustration with this line, and a response from the Polish Jewish composer Szymon Laks, who wrote that the recollection penned by Iwaszkiewicz was ugly. Yet the anti-Semitic subtext of these comments is never named as such, either by Zofia or any of her interlocutors. The most explicit acknowledgement of anti-Semitism, however, appears in an extended anecdote that Zofia includes in the book under the title, The Incident in the Castle. Here she's writing in her own voice, and she begins by stating, even before I had married Mateusz Glinski, I was shocked as a result of the anti-Semitic aggression to which I was a victim in an unexpected place and environment. That place and environment being a reception held presumably at Warsaw's castle. There, Mateusz leaves her alone for a couple of minutes, during which she is approached by two strangers who hiss at her the following. She tells them off, and Mateusz returns. Shaken, she goes home and never tells them about the incident. This story is curiously out of step with the ethos and contents of the rest of the book. It focuses on Zofia explicitly, it does not focus on Mateusz's accomplishments, and it describes a short passing moment instead of the broad strokes of biography and accomplishment that are its primary tasks. Mateusz, she states, is completely unaware that this even took place. But what the anecdote does seem to accomplish is to make explicit a subtext. It reminds readers of how quickly non-Jewish Poles could attack even educated, accomplished Polish Jewish musicians such as Mateusz. It underscores perhaps the persuasive quotidian nature of anti-Semitism in interwar Poland, and thus suggests a context of lived experience through which to interpret the insinuations and avoidances that permeate the text as a whole. All right, so I'm going to wrap up with a few brief conclusions here. The first, and I think the most obvious, is that the lack of evidence concerning anti-Semitism among acculturated Polish Jewish musicians is not evidence of lack. Just because we don't have record of it doesn't mean it wasn't happening. I think, moreover, musicologists must consider carefully what types of responses to anti-Semitism musicians found feasible to make in the first place. It's important to consider the context of enunciation, the politics of audience in this regard. Glinski was often writing for a Polish-speaking readership, much of which was not Jewish, and he has a tendency to reroute responsibility for anti-Semitic attacks onto broader political circumstance or to reframe them as interpersonal squabbles. This makes his story more palatable to that intended audience. For those writing about this time and place, however, a well-meaning desire to foreground Polish Jewish voices without considering that context can distort the historiography in pretty important ways. It can make the interwar years seem as if they were defined by squabbles over aesthetics, rather than by fundamental questions of race, identity, and exclusion that shape Polish Jewish lives, but about which many of them chose to say relatively little. And this brings me to what I promise is my final point, which concerns the challenges of examining in particular how acculturated musicians responded to anti-Semitism. I found it useful here to reference James Loeffler's brilliant work on responses to Richard Wagner among Jewish musicians. I think one of the interesting things that he shows here is how many Jewish musical intellectuals in Russia were able to develop new musical idioms in response to this anti-Semitism. So while in other words, Wagner and these intellectuals rejected ideas of assimilation, even if they really didn't agree about much of anything else. But Glinski and many of the musicians that I have written about did not choose this path. Rather than embracing Jewish themes in his writing, Glinski framed his projects time and time again as service to Polish musical culture. he didn't really denounce or critique anti-Semitism, but rather chose to continue working on his projects, continue to explain how they serve the broader national good. Perhaps in this sense, his evasiveness about anti-Semitism is a paradox of identification with and service to a Polish musical culture at a time that it was being reconfigured under ideologies of exclusionary ethno-nationalism. More broadly, making audible the impacts of anti-Semitism within the milieu of acculturated Polish Jewish musicians requires attending not only to explicit responses they have made, but also considering how they underscored their belonging to the very collectives they were trying to be excluded from. So to return to this excellent two sentences from the call with which I began, we might want to uncouple the ideas of giving voice and restoring agency. Focusing on agency and actions, I would say, can illuminate much about the responses of Polish Jewish musicians to anti-Semitism, even when their voices, their writings, their diaries, and their letters might seem to evade the issue. Thank you. I don't know.
Hello? Ah, excellent. I'll take that. Okay. Thank you so much for this really wonderful paper, Mackenzie. The floor is now open for questions for Mackenzie, our first speaker. So I will come around with the mic, and if you have a question you'd like to ask, just raise your hand and I'll come to you. Okay, great. Excellent.
Thank you so much for this, Mackenzie. This is really interesting. I can't believe I didn't know this guy's story before. Clearly, I have to go read your book. But yeah, I'm wondering, I was really struck by these last few things you said about his service, his focus on his service to Polish culture, and by the parallel I see to Victor Klemperer and to people like him. And it strikes me that this is really unusual in the Polish Jewish context. This is something I think we're much more accustomed to seeing in the German Jewish context of someone who is so assimilated that they truly do identify with that sort of majoritarian culture. And we see this in cases like Klemperer, who was a World War I veteran who's very focused on I served my country, I am a German patriot. How can it turn on me this way, right? And I wonder if you might want to reflect on that. I know you're using the term acculturation, not assimilation here, and maybe think about what that term is doing. I know we typically use it in the Polish context, and think about maybe those parallels. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that question, Jules. I'll try to talk into the mic, although I do have a tendency to wander around during these things. Yeah, I mean, the term acculturated is used in the Polish context and often, I think, rightly because of the kind of variety of Jewishnesses that can, of people who are also Polish speaking or in some ways identify with various aspects of the Polish cultural context. So in some ways it's a very broad term. I'm sympathetic to the critiques of that assimilation is a kind of catch-all that can capture a bunch of different processes. There's acculturation, there's emancipation, sometimes even secularization is thrown into questions of assimilation. But I think in the context of Gliński, and this is not true of everyone I work on, that the Jewishness is primarily being ascribed by others. Right, there's not much evidence that he thought of himself as being Jewish in any kind of relevant way. Exactly, yes. So that's not true of all Polish Jewish classical musicians in this period. Someone like Alexander Tansman, I think, is an interesting counterexample who really sort of discovers Jewish identity after the war. Even someone like Zofia Lisa, who's a musicologist, is involved in explicitly Jewish-identified circles during that period. So I think there is a kind of spectrum, if you will, or there's a diversity, there's a wide range, even within this kind of bucket of acculturated, of their particular responses and meanings. But I do find with many of these people that there is this strong sense of Polish intelligentsia as an identity that in some ways works above and against ethnic, national, racial identity labels during that period. But thank you for that. Yeah.
I have a question about, maybe the sort of status of being in exile after the war, and whether or not like there's a perceptible difference between folks who did go back and continued to pursue their musical careers in post-war communist Poland, where there was like a different logic of, you know, sort of suppressing that Jewish identity, and like, you know, it's just like a totally different kind of anti-Semitic context, I guess. But I wonder if like there are folks, if you see a notable difference there. And I'm asking only because like I happen to have a colleague at Rutgers who's working on her aunt, who was a pianist, who was a communist, and so decided to go back to Poland after the war, and married a Gentile and converted, and, you know, just wanted to be a part of the Polish, you know, art music scene, and also a communist. So I wonder how that fits in the retrospective reflections that you've been sharing with us. Thanks.
That's a great question. It goes in many different ways. In general, after, say, 48, 49, it becomes very difficult for there to be most of the people I'm talking about would not explicitly share Jewish-coded experiences or identities. Some wouldn't at any way. So it's certainly true that you don't see a lot of that in Poland particularly. There are exceptions. There are interesting complexities. There are moments of commemoration where that really does come out. There are films where Jewish experience kind of emerges in plain sight, to use a useful phrase. But in general, you don't see a lot of it, and a lot of scholars have talked about the particular memory politics that are at stake in this kind of de-Judaizing of the 20th century. So in some ways, the fascinating part is what the exiles do. Some do find, or maybe I'll call them émigrés, exile is sometimes a loaded term, but those living abroad, some of them do find a space for a more like explicit embrace of Jewish themes. Tadeusz Siegfried Kastern is a composer who ends up in New York after the war. He composes an opera in English. That's a memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, so it's very clearly identified within a memorial politics of that early post-war moment. Tansman is another person who explicitly moves in that direction. Glinski does not. He doesn't seem to be interested in that. I mean, I don't know why he doesn't ultimately at the end of the day. I can kind of speculate on that. But it's not necessarily the case that all of them who are outside of communist Poland find more space or desire to embrace elements of Jewish identity. Some do. Shimon Laks has some really interesting Jewish-inspired pieces that I think are enabled through that kind of connection. And I think another interesting dimension is the degree to which Glinski really wants to remain connected to Poland. He's constantly trying to get himself involved in various things there. He gets involved in a huge scandal about fake Chopin letters that goes on and on and on and on and on. I mean, he's quite conceptualizing himself in relation to Poland kind of enduring ways. The purges?
The anti-Semitic purges in 68, right? Like
Yeah.
There's no reflection. Is that externalized as like a Soviet imposition as opposed to like a Polish culture?
Glinski doesn't say much about that. Yeah.
Mackenzie, thank you so much. This was wonderful. My question is coming at this from my own work with mostly German speakers in the 19th century, but in thinking about this Testament document, right, because there's quite a lot of the assimilated Germans in who are doing more what we might call like a memoir, right, or an autobiography in English, but usually a memoir. That will have this sort of similar format where it's not quite like their whole life from start to finish, and it's a little bit wandering, and sometimes it might be something they wrote before. And I'm thinking in particular, both Karl Goldmark and Ferdinand Hiller have little tiny passages where all of a sudden they'll like stick in a little rub about somebody said something anti-Semitic to me, and in some cases not using the word anti-Semitic because it wasn't a word that they had conceptualized. But I think Hiller uses antisemitismus. But I'm curious where, from a Polish context, things like memoir or these kind of collected memorializing documents, like, is this quite different from other ones that you see either in this generation or surrounding this generation, or are there similar types of these documents with these sort of, oh yes, and like here's that little anti-Semitic experience they had? Do you think this is sort of a unique one?
I think there are ones that are similar and there are ones that are different. I think, so I'll just say one thing. He also did write memoirs which were published in part in 1977 in Poland, but honestly, maybe I'll phrase that more diplomatically. The parts of the memoirs that they chose to publish almost exclusively have to do with fin de siècle Russia. So it's like, oh, he was working with Glazunov, cool, right? It doesn't say much about the interwar years. And actually the only part of that gets published here is part 2, the second entry, the first entry, how did we get out of, or how did we escape the Hitlerian persecution? And the book is really clearly, the testament is very clearly motivated by a desire to settle scores, right? There's a real sense in both Mateusz and his widow that history has not treated him kindly, and that this is an opportunity to rectify that, even though it's being published in probably 200 copies in London, and very few people are actually going to read it. There's a whole polemic against Halina Rodzinska in there. The epic poem is also kind of a very bizarre thing. So there are definitely elements of this that I have never seen anywhere else. Yeah. Well, anti-Semitism is one of many things that's being put here in this far wide range. I've not encountered an epic poem written by the widow of any of the other people I've studied, so that's pretty unusual. But there are generic similarities. The idea of like there's a bit of Festschrift in here, right? There is a bit of public letter writing, which I think is a big component of this. There's a bit of assembling previously written work into a whole. So those are all definitely informing it. But in odd ways, it's a book without a huge public, as far as I've been able to determine.
Do we have any other questions for Mackenzie? Okay, at the front.
Does he comment at all on the irony of being in Rome and being able to resume his musical career, which he abandoned when he was in Poland, even though he's feeling nostalgic, of course, for being in Poland? Does he talk about this at all?
He talks about Rome as a place where he has opportunities he didn't have before. Does he comment on the irony of it, right? More quickly able to establish himself in like 2 years as an immigrant in Mussolini's Italy?
Resume,
no, he doesn't.
And resume a major career in music.
No, I mean, this is the closest he gets here, right? I've obtained among foreigners all that was so difficult to achieve at home. But it's incredibly elliptical, right? Yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, I think we may wrap up our Q&A session, if that's all right, Mackenzie. But Perfect. Please feel free to bring any other questions you might have to him today or later. Okay, now I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so our next speaker is Monty James, who is a PhD student in history at Brown University. His paper is titled Krzysztof Penderecki, Representations of Auschwitz and Antisemitism in Polish Classical Musical Production. So as we make sure slides are pulled up, please welcome Monty.
The eminent Polish composer Krzysztof Penderecki, born 1933, died 2020, reflected a deep personal Catholic religiosity with an interest in Polish history in much of his music. He had an impact on Polish modernist culture and post-war memory that was emblematic of its many contradictions. Following de-Stalinization and the 1956 thaw, Penderecki enthusiastically embraced the avant-garde and experimental technology, but nevertheless had an ambivalent relationship with modernist orthodoxy, and soon pivoted to tonal, religion-influenced compositions closer to neo-romanticism. His work also engaged with Poland's complicated history of anti-Semitism. I will explore how Penderecki's aesthetic evolution reflected not only broader political shifts in Poland with the communist government's anti-Semitic policies in the 1960s and the civil society protests of the 1970s and 1980s, but also changes in his own self-fashioning and inconsistent desire to present himself as apolitical. Penderecki's creative output put him on the crossroads of challenging social and ethical issues related to history and memory. His work, infused with religious symbolism and linked to political movements like Solidarity, merits further consideration, not only given his important role in Christian anti-communism, but also in his multifaceted relationship to the anti-Semitic elements in Polish culture and history. In other words, by examining several pieces like the Death Brigade from 1963, the Dies Irae from 1967, and most prominently the Polish Requiem from 1980 to 84, I propose that Penderecki's career offers a case study for some of the larger issues of Polish historical memory as a career shaped in several ways by the political and cultural anti-Semitism. While Penderecki's commemorative music is closely related to Polish Christian nationalist narratives surrounding the Holocaust, it also speaks to what Hannah Arendt famously described as the trap of conflating specific crimes against the Jewish people with crimes against humanity. In other words, Penderecki's work, particularly the Polish Requiem, points to the problems with universal commemoration of tragedy and victimhood. Given a variety of circumstances in the Polish post-war period, from an unwillingness to confront its role in the Holocaust, to the continuation of traditionalist Christian discourse and anti-Judaism, to communist foreign policy towards Israel, different types of political anti-Semitism restricted Polish composers from explicitly addressing certain historical topics. Broadly speaking, we can see Polish communist anti-Semitism in two main areas. First, in the late 1940s and early 50s during the Stalinist period, which had Moscow-directed anti-Zionism and accused many Eastern European Jews of being, quote, rootless cosmopolitans. And the second wave, most broadly speaking, we can also see in the late 1960s with the anti-Semitic campaigns after the Six-Day War and the March 1968 student protests. The 1960s, after the Stalinist period, saw some political restrictions lifted, but anti-Semitism persisted. Penderecki and his contemporaries like Henryk Górecki, Wojciech Kilar, and others reflected on memories of the Second World War and commemorated their victims through their music, but the Holocaust remained a challenging topic to represent artistically for these composers, and musical works were often mediated by certain aesthetic and political decisions by the composers, the cultural organizations, and the government censorship. So Penderecki stood out as a composer who confronted these issues in Holocaust memory, especially among these more sort of Catholic Polish nationalist composers. In an interview shortly before his 2020 death, Penderecki described his childhood in Dębica, a small town near Galicia, with a large Jewish population. There, Penderecki had witnessed the tragedies of the Second World War and the Holocaust. His uncle was murdered in Katyn by the Soviets. His family was also very multicultural. His grandfather was a German painter who had converted from Protestantism to Catholicism. His grandmother was a member of the Armenian Church. And he grew up alongside Jewish children in his town, and he recounted in this interview that he was raised in a, quote, spirit of tolerance. And so then with the ghettoization and the murder of his Jewish neighbors, and his family moved into an Aryanized apartment, he later suggested that, quote, I think that I had to write music first of all to say which side I am on, end quote. Penderecki's personal life of diverse cultural and religious connections led to creative output that drew on his own past and Polish history, from his own recollections of hearing klezmer music as a child to memories of meeting, while as a student, meeting Karol Wojtyła, the future Pope John Paul II. And he incorporated in many of his works, which I'll talk about, Jewish texts and Holocaust testimonies. So before the Polish Requiem, which I'll talk about later, he composed other works related to the Holocaust, notably the Death Brigade, or the Brigada Śmierci from 1963, and the Dies Irae of 1967. The Polish radio commissioned the former piece for the 20th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and the latter piece was written for the unveiling of the International Monument to the Victims of Fascism at Auschwitz-Birkenau in April 1967, just weeks before the start of the Six Days War and the renewed anti-Semitic campaign from the Polish government. The Death Brigade was based on the journal of the Holocaust survivor Leon Welitzker, and it was translated the same year into English as the Janowska Road. It's a 30-minute radio play or monologue with incidental music, but it abstracted this text, the Welitzker's text, from its original historical context through the use of modernist tape music and other electronics, thereby creating a certain distance to the historical realism of the narrative. This step was necessary, according to the composer, as sound engineer Eugeniusz Rudnik argued that quote, Penderecki's greatness is that we managed to resist the temptation of naturalism and didn't show skulls cracking open in a roaring fire. Yet the critical reception of the piece was largely negative. Zygmunt Michalski, the editor-in-chief of Poland's main musical publication, Ruch Muzyczny, wrote, quote, I am surprised that an artist of Penderecki's standing would mix a realistic document with an attempt at creating an acoustic framework that immediately suggested a work of art, end quote. The writer Jaroslav Iwaszkiewicz declared that Penderecki's work was too brutal, and the organizer of the concert, and who was also the director of the publishing house, Tadeusz Olszewski, regretted the program altogether. So, in other words, most who had attended the concert thought that this experimental aesthetics and the concert hall setting were ineffective or even inappropriate for Holocaust commemoration. The Polish radio canceled the planned broadcast, and Penderecki withdrew the piece, but he later defended himself, saying that, quote, in the generation of people who survived the war, someone had to write such a piece. So after its 1964 premiere, it was unperformed until 2011 at the Warsaw Autumn Festival, and I think it was recorded in 2012, I think at the Donaueschingen Festival. So it would only be later in the 1970s that Penderecki turned towards neo-romanticism and a more direct engagement with historical themes, but this engagement, I'll argue, has its own problems. So this coincided, This coincided with important cultural and political changes in Poland. So 1 year after John Paul II's 1978 election, the Pope visited Poland and he celebrated Mass at Auschwitz-Birkenau. A few months later, Lech Wałęsa, who had just founded the Solidarność trade union, commissioned Penderecki's Lacrimosa for the December 1980 dedication of the Monument to the Fallen Worker, which commemorated the 1970 strike in which several Gdansk shipyard workers were killed. The ceremony and the Holy Mass in Gdansk, which you see here in the middle, were choreographed by the famed film director Andrzej Wajda, and they unveiled 3 40-meter crosses. So as scholar Genevieve Zubrzycki has noted, the cross became an important symbol for Solidarność, especially after the 1979 visit, John Paul II's 1979 visit to the country. And in the following years, Penderecki expanded the Lacrimosa into the full Polish Requiem, where he added Agnus Dei, dedicated to Stefan Wyszyński, the cardinal, after his 1981 death. He added the Recordare, which I'll talk more about, for the beatification of St. Maximilian Kolbe in 1982. The Dies Irae for the 40th anniversary, different Dies Irae from the earlier one, for the 40th anniversary of the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, the Liberame for the victims of the Katyn massacre. But in December 1981, there was the Polish government's declaration of martial law, and it essentially made the Polish premiere, planned Polish premiere, well, it wasn't actually planned, but the hopes for a Polish premiere of the Requiem impossible. So it had a partial premiere in Washington, D.C. with the National Symphony Orchestra and Rostropovich in November 1983, and a full premiere with the same conductor and the Stuttgart Radio Orchestra in West Germany in September 1984. Penderecki then revised the Requiem further in 1993, adding a Sanctus and a Chacona for strings in memory of John Paul II in 2005. The Polish Requiem has often been analyzed in this context of martial law and solidarity as a form of protest music, but it's also connected to Holocaust memory and Polish anti-Semitism. While the list of dedicatees of the Requiem draws from numerous tragedies in modern Polish history, one movement stands out on this issue. The Recordare was dedicated to Maximilian Kolbe, a Catholic priest murdered at Auschwitz, who had volunteered to take the place of another prisoner condemned in a collective punishment in the aftermath of an escape attempt at Auschwitz. Though widely respected in Catholic intellectual circles, Kolbe was also known for having produced controversial anti-Semitic statements in the interwar period. He was an editor of several Catholic publications and disseminated stories about, quote, Jewish Masonic conspiracies, and described Jews as, quote, Christ killers. And so this controversy after his death of his anti-Semitism escalated, especially after 1971 with his beatification and then the 1982 canonization. So that's the process in the Catholic Church of being made a saint. And he was declared a martyr. And that's the event that prompted this movement of the piece, the Recordare. And so while I don't argue that this requiem is itself an anti-Semitic work, the Recordare, which is a piece, as the name suggests, literally about remembrance, presents a distorted view of contemporary Polish history, particularly if one interprets the requiem as a requiem for Poland. Indeed, in a 1988 acceptance speech for an honorary doctorate at the University of Poznan, Penderecki asserted that, quote, my art stems from profoundly Christian roots and aims at reconstructing a human metaphysical universe shattered by the cataclysm of the 20th century. Art should be the source of difficult hope. However, if it were not for this dedication of the movement, the connection to the Holocaust in the Recordare would not necessarily be obvious to the listener, while its links to Polish Christian identity are much more overt. So Penderecki's turn from the modernist avant-garde to what musicologist Cindy Bylander has termed the Polish neo-romanticism from the 1970s and 1980s paralleled a certain turn in Polish national and Catholic memorialization of the Holocaust. As part of the Dies Irae sequence of the Requiem Mass in Catholic liturgy, Penderecki's Recordare uses the text of the Pia Jesu prayer. In addition, while the order of Mass in liturgy is entirely in Latin, Penderecki inserts a Polish prayer at the beginning of this movement, the Święty Boże hymn in praise of the Holy Trinity. And it's the first appearance of a Polish text in the entire work up to that point. Then it comes back later towards the end of the piece. So like his earlier 1966 St. Luke Passion, Penderecki uses a famous prayer, the Crux Fidelis, in the four-note motif of this prayer. The Recordare uses a famous Catholic prayer sung on Good Friday in Catholic liturgy, the Święty Boże hymn. And it's overlaid with this Recordare prayer, and it would be identifiable to Polish Catholic listeners. This semiotic connection between Christian nationalism and Penderecki's musical style through the symbol of the cross, like the Crux Fidelis in the St. Luke Passion and then again in this prayer, merits further study. But nevertheless, I think that the piece's mediation of Auschwitz into Catholic liturgy is emblematic of this problem of facing universalization of Holocaust memory in this Polish Catholic setting. So on the surface, Penderecki's music attempted to sidestep the issue of Christian anti-Semitism and the problem of Polish victimhood in the Auschwitz post-war narrative in Poland. Yet with the Recordare, it too was part of a certain cultural shift, one that Żubrzycki has called a, quote, move from the national to the universal in Holocaust memory, in which both the site itself of Auschwitz and its symbolic value were now recast as a Polish national and a Catholic symbol. So while the Lacrimosa that I mentioned earlier for the Monument of the Fallen Worker commemorates a very separate event from for example, the 1985 placement of a papal cross, which maybe I can talk more about in the Q&A, Penderecki, this work itself bridges these two histories of Auschwitz as a Polish national site and this solidarity protest music. So scholars like Andrea Bollman have described the Requiem as, quote, a synergy between Polish Roman Catholicism and musical nationalism through liturgy, while others have noticed its similarity to Giuseppe Verdi's 1874 Messa de Requiem in both its musical language and its form. Indeed, in a 1997 interview, Penderecki reflected how his creative process for the Lacrimosa, the first movement, which he wrote in only 1 month before the unveiling of the Gdansk Memorial, began with his stumbling across the score of Verdi's Requiem while conducting in Baden-Baden in West Germany. This comparison with the celebrated 19th century Italian composer raises several questions as to how Penderecki expressed himself politically and religiously. Historian Michael Steinberg, for example, has described Verdi's Requiem as, quote, both a sacred and anti-clerical work. The work's sacredness lies in the sacralization of a new nation produced by the Risorgimento, end quote, for which Catholics in the new Italian nation at the time meant that they had to, quote, face an agonizing choice between the nation and the church. So perhaps the same ambiguous relationship between the church and the nation can be felt in Penderecki's Requiem. In the 1997 interview, the composer himself characterized the religious nature of the Requiem in a way that attempts to distance it from the national Polish Christian context. At that time, in 1997, Penderecki deemed his Requiem not explicitly religious. Quote, in the past I have used Hebrew and Russian Orthodox church music, but my main inspiration is the solid German 19th century symphonic tradition and Renaissance polyphony, end quote. In the same interview, Penderecki also tried to deny that the Requiem is a political piece. Quote, I don't write political music. Political music is immediately obsolete. My threnody for the victims of Hiroshima remains important because it is abstract music. The Requiem is dedicated to certain peoples and events, but the music has a broader significance, end quote. Yet this stands in contrast to his interviews from the previous decade, in which he positioned himself as uniquely tasked with promoting solidarity and civil protest, a task that he claims to have delivered on, unlike his composer colleagues like Lutosławski. And so while some of Penderecki's earlier works, particularly his opera The Devils of Loudun, were critical of institutional corruption and the church in some ways, Penderecki's reputation in Poland, especially in the 1980s, was undeniably linked to the church and solidarity. So furthermore, in the same 1997 interview, he argues that the Polish Requiem bears little relation to his early years of innovation in the avant-garde in the 1960s. Quote, my threnody for the victims of Hiroshima is still avant-garde, but the age of experimentation is over. We discovered everything, end quote. Returning to the issue around the dedication of Kolbe, it's a coincidence that the priest had served as a missionary in Nagasaki, Japan in the 1930s, years before his death at Auschwitz, that then became a symbol for Polish Catholic martyrdom. Yet this connection between Nagasaki and Auschwitz is important. What the scholar Jae-Hyun Lim in his recent book has called a mnemonic solidarity between the historic site of Catholic persecution in Japan and the Polish Holocaust memory in the Christian context. And it's a framework that one, I could argue, can extend to Penderecki's own work, particularly his famous piece, The Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima, which he's explicitly thinking about in comparing to the Requiem in that interview. And in 1982, the same year as his Recordare, the Japanese author Shusako Endo, who's best known for his novel Silence, which was adapted into Martin Scorsese's film, wrote a widely read nonfiction essay about Kolbe, and then a novel called Sachiko, which has been recently translated into English, I think in 2020. The novel juxtaposed two narratives. On the one hand, there's the fictional story concerning the moral dilemmas of a Japanese Catholic who's drafted as a kamikaze pilot, and his American childhood friend who pilots the plane that drops the atomic bomb on Nagasaki. And on the other hand is a dramatized biography of Maximilian Kolbe, his missionary work, and then his eventual murder at Auschwitz. So this link between Japanese and Polish suffering, Catholic identity, and shared victimhood is also indirectly found in Penderecki's music. But I think that this is something that needs more work on, but I don't think it's a coincidence. Yet, if the Polish Requiem is not strictly religious music or political music, in Penderecki's words, then what ethical and aesthetic boundaries, if any, should be in place for artists to draw on these themes, both of Christian martyrdom but also Holocaust memory? Such questions were more explicit in the post-'89 period in Penderecki's music. He wrote in 1996, he wrote the Symphony No. 7, The Seven Gates of Jerusalem, and then in 2009, most directly, he wrote the Kaddish, which commemorated the 65th anniversary of the destruction of the Łódź ghetto. It's a cantata, like some of his earlier pieces that I mentioned, and he uses the mourner's Kaddish prayer, as well as poems by Abram Chitrin, who was a teenager murdered at Auschwitz. And the inscription of the Kaddish piece reads, quote, to all Łódź Abrameks, or little Abrams, who desired to live, and to the Poles who saved the Jews. So to conclude, his 1989 works speak to a renewed dialogue and openness, but also has issues of conflating these two stories, both the Christian nationalist story and the Holocaust experience for Jews in Poland. So even if Penderecki tried to sidestep the issue of the Polish nationalist iconography that I've talked about by claiming that he didn't write political music, his work touched on the contested link between Polish Christianity, nationalism, and anti-Semitism, as well as its relationship to Holocaust memory. What can nonetheless be gleaned from this often ambiguous nexus between all these themes, which in its universalization of all these themes also has its problems, I would argue, is that music holds the potential for a real impact as a symbol for resistance to oppression and powerful commemorations of tragedy, but how we go about commemorating those issues is important. It's therefore important to understand the hidden narratives and the silent voices embedded in this history. Thank you.
Hello, there we go. Okay. So I can take questions now for Monty. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and I will come to you. Maybe I'll kick us off, though, with a brief question, if that's okay. I was really fascinated by that quote that you pulled of Penderecki saying that he had to compose to show exactly what side he was on.
Yeah.
And it seems like quite loaded to say that. And also like he was very consciously seeking to position himself in public reception and in the public consciousness. What do you think his motivations were with that? Can you kind of read into that a little bit more? Because it really does seem to hover over the rest of what you've talked about today.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And something I didn't really go into, I probably should have, is this post-'89 period, and Genevieve Zubritsky has written just, I think, 2-3 years ago, a new book about this as sort of philo-Semitism in post-'89 Polish culture. And so sort of the bigger question is this move of sort of Polish Christians, liberal Christians in Poland, being or self-identifying as philo-Semitic, does that actually erase, or not necessarily erase, but does that sort of hide the larger anti-Semitism embedded in Polish Christian culture?
Right. Especially because you pointed out that his family moved into the house.
Exactly,
of a family
yeah,
that
and
had
he doesn't really talk that much about that, but yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, any questions from the audience? Yes, back there. Okay, I'm coming to you.
Hi, thanks so much for this paper. I have first just a comment and then second like a larger question. And the comment in regard to the Holocaust universalization, I think like starting with Hannah Arendt is all fine and well, but I think maybe looking more towards like Michael Rothberg's framework might be a little bit more helpful, and really positioning it more in contemporary scholarship just for that as you continue this work, because I think it's really, really interesting. And I would just really like to perhaps hear you expand a little bit more on, because I think you're exactly right, that this like mnemonic solidarity and the connection to the victims of Hiroshima, I think there's clearly like a connection there. And I just think it's so interesting that he wrote this first, and then he's writing this music that's supposedly supposed to stand in for Holocaust memory. And then, so I would love to hear you just talk a little bit more about your thoughts on that, because I think you have some more on it. And then, I guess I do have one more comment. I think, like, Auschwitz-Birkenau, even though it might be presenting itself as more of like a universal, like more of a wider presentation earlier on, it's still always nationalistic. It is, and it's still even to this day. And I think, like, thinking about that presentation in 1967, I mean, like, the Jewish exhibit didn't even open up until 2014. Yeah. So there's so many nationalist memory politics going on in there, and it's so entertaining. But yeah, I would just love to hear about any more thoughts that you have between the Threnody and how that maybe manifested later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, thank you for all the points. I think with the Auschwitz Memorial in 1967, I guess this is sort of an oversimplification, but I guess my point there was sort of this communist era narrative of victims of fascism as a sort of, exactly, it's a solidarity in a certain way, I guess, but not in the same way as obviously the later solidarity. But yeah, so the connection, the mnemonic solidarity, I'm still working through how to actually prove that, because as you say, it was written first, and it was famously not originally titled that. It was, I think, titled something like 8 minutes, 37 seconds after the John Cage, or sort of he was inspired by John Cage. And so why he actually then changed the title in this sort of very, I would say, overtly political statement in some ways, is an interesting question. And I think that also this 1980s moment is an interesting moment for Polish culture. And of course, the 82 novel by Endo is a coincidence that it's the same time, but I think it's showing you a larger moment where in the 80s there's further distance, obviously, from the historical events of the 1940s. And so there's this new sort of impulse for Penderecki to sort of broaden his scope, maybe. That could be one way to sort of show he has solidarity among cultures across the world. But I have to think more about that, yeah.
I can come to you if you have questions. Oh, excellent. Coming to you.
I'm not sure it does, yeah.
Thank you for some really rich and interesting stuff. Could you reread the Zygmunt Michalski quote
Yeah.
for me?
Towards the beginning? Yes. He said, quote, "I'm surprised that an artist of Penderecki's standing would mix a realistic document with an attempt at creating an acoustic framework that immediately suggests a work of art."
Okay, cool, thanks. So my question is about the aesthetic terminology that's at play behind here. So Michalski is critiquing this as being too realistic. I think you had Rudnik saying is we resisted the temptations of naturalism, I think is the word. And then in the 97 interview, he's talking about like abstraction. So I'm wondering what you think they mean, especially by realistic or naturalistic. Is that related to broader discourses about like the problems of representing trauma? Is that something completely different that's going on? What are these aesthetic terms that seem to be kind of undergirding this story of universalization?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, this sort of 1960s moment for Penderecki is known as sort of this big sort of avant-garde guy. You know, sonorism is this sort of big aesthetic of sort of, it's not naturalism. It seems to me that Rudnik is using naturalism as a binary, as opposed to Penderecki's sonorism. And so this is actually an avant-garde piece, and that naturalism wouldn't be appropriate for depicting this trauma, this violence, in a sort of a realistic or naturalistic way. But then Michalski points out that the document that he's using, the text, the Dialectics text, is a realistic document. So there's this issue of like, how do you adapt a realistic or naturalistic and historical event into something that's avant-garde? And is that appropriate to do? So Rudnik would say yes, Michalski would say no, it seems like.
Okay, another couple questions from the audience. I'm getting my steps.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation. One of the things you pointed out, many things you pointed out, is that Penderecki is well aware at different points of the way in which he's reaching out to his audience and how the audiences might respond to the different messages which have changed over time. Likewise, you pointed out that there are these very different currents in Polish society, intellectual society, some still anti-Semitic, some philo-Semitic, and so on. Could you expand a little bit more about the reception of these ideas from the Polish side, from the Polish cultural side in general?
Yeah, I think especially in this 1980s moment, it's something I have to think more about, is sort of this relationship between philo-Semitism and sort of the solidarity movement and this particular intellectual milieu of sort of solidarity, and just also in the term solidarity as a sort of a coalition of different ideas, right? Different political positions, different backgrounds. And there's literature on how sort of solidarity itself was also targeted by, in anti-Semitic ways by the government. So people like Adam Michnik, who wrote the book The Church and the Left, he writes about having this broad coalition, but the government also and the secret police also had anti-Semitic campaigns against him. So it's this sort of complicated moment for Penderecki as sort of a very politically active composer in the Solidarity movement, but also, I guess, positioning himself, especially after '89, as this sort of philo-Semitic composer. And I don't want to reduce him to just that, but I think that there is a connection there in terms of his political ideas and political activism in solidarity with his positions on anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism. Does that try to answer your question, or it's yeah?
This is a subject you could give another lecture on.
Yeah, I'm still working through it. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? No? Okay, well then please join me in thanking our speakers for this final panel.